Inspired by the life of the savvy and ambitious Colombian businesswoman Griselda Blanco comes a new Netflix original limited series. Griselda tells the story of a devoted mother who, with her lethal blend of charm and relentless savagery, creates one of the most powerful cartels in history. Witness Sofia Vergara's captivating transformation into the godmother of the underworld. Griselda, streaming January 25th, only on Netflix.
Join me, 48 Hours correspondent Erin Moriarty, on my podcast, My Life of Crime, as I take on true crime investigations like no other. This season, I'm looking into the labyrinth of crime and secrets within families. I'm cutting straight to the evidence and talking to the people directly involved, including investigators and the families of victims. Listen to My Life of Crime with Erin Moriarty wherever you get your podcasts.
A note to listeners, the following podcast contains content that may not be suitable for all audiences.
Violent individuals who would kill people, singular murderers, multiple murderers, mass murderers, and then obviously serial murderers. There's no profit involved here to speak of, but yet they are committing these very violent crimes. And first of all, Laura deserves a lot of credit. She's worked very hard at something that most people don't want to work at, which is talking with these folks being serial killers. How I met Laura was at a conference. I think when I first started out doing this in the 70s, I distinctly remember a lot of skepticism from the law enforcement community. Law enforcement officers saying this sounds like witch hunting, this sounds like random shots in the dark. And in fact, some of that is true in the early stages, because in the early stages, where the validity of these types of studies gains its muscle is in the numbers. It's an actuarial game.
Actually, he wasn't placed in the orphanage, but the mother, the couple did not want children.
Right.
The family had made the young mother, she was like 17, give up him and his Irish twin brother. Charles was a year younger, and he never felt wanted by the mother. The father never came back for him. And then he's placed with the two aunt and uncle and he always said he felt like he was just there renting a room or something, like totally ignored. Like,
You are listening to Partners in True Crime. We are your hosts, Rob and Cindy Dorfman.
We would like to thank all of our listeners around the world who have been tuning into our podcast for the past year. Without your support, we could not do this. So thank you.
We appreciate all of the great reviews, so please keep them coming as well. Just go on to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, drop us a review, subscribe, and tell your friends about what we're doing here. Also, feel free to take pieces of the podcast and share with others. Our goal is to get the word out to as many people as possible to let them know what we're doing for victims' families. Any and all help is welcome.
Now on today's episode, Laura is introducing us to Dr. ALLAN Pass, who has been a mentor to her in her research and has helped guide her in her conversations with the serial killers.
Dr. ALLAN Pass has been practicing in the mental health care profession since 1973. He has been recognized in both state and federal court jurisdictions as a clinical and forensic mental health expert in both criminal and civil courts for both the defense and the prosecution.
We are excited to have him here today, so let's hear what he has to say. Okay, great. Yeah, so ALLAN, we can start with, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
The name of the consulting firm is National Behavioral Science Consultants. I'm the director and founder of that firm, and then I have a series of other people, a bunch of people who work for me or affiliate consultants under contract, each of them having their own respective specialty. The website will show you basically the kind of areas that we provide services to. My background is in, obviously, behavioral sciences and mental health, with a specialty in violent behavior and violent psychosexual pathologies. Although my doctoral work at the University of Pittsburgh specialized in that. And upon finishing and completing that, I also did my internship and worked for the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections for approximately 19 years in the Western Diagnostic Classification Center, which is a diagnostic unit housed in the Supermax of Western State Prison, which is now since closed. And as a result of that experience, had the capacity then to test, evaluate, spend time with, do treatment with some of the most violent offenders in the state of Pennsylvania. The history of me getting involved with these types of cases dates back to the early 70s, wherein, because of the nature of my specialty work, I started to examine a theory basically at the time. And this was before the behavioral sciences unit from the FBI was even developed. And the theory that I wanted to explore at that time was, explaining it in very basic terms, I was of the opinion that individuals commit crimes specifically for need reduction, and that every crime that is committed, crimes are generally committed based upon personality types. So I'm looking at correlations in personalities. What's the difference between someone who sets fire to a building with nobody in it and they know it's vacant versus someone who does set fire to a building and they know it's occupied? What's the difference in a personality between someone who's a consistent armed robber versus non-armed robbery? What's the personality factors associated with burglars, and so forth and so on. So if you look at all the various offender topologies across the board, my focus was to look for, is there central personality core factors associated with these types of offense topologies? The work that I was doing in the Diagnostic Center provided me with a perfect library to conduct that research, because we had offenders of all categories, of all ages, all races across the board from anywhere throughout the state of Pennsylvania at the time. And as a result of that research, I did in fact start to see correlations of specific types of personalities looking to satisfy specific types of needs that they had at the time of committing the crime. Obviously, there's property offenders, and the majority of property offenders commit property offenses for profit. So those didn't fascinate me very much at all. But the other crimes that were committed that didn't have a profit factor associated with them, but in fact had a very personal, deep-seated emotional need associated with them, those started to catch my eye. And obviously in that group were the folks who would assault other people, sexually assault people, non-sexual assaults, but still assaults. Violent individuals who would kill people, singular murderers, multiple murderers, mass murderers, and then obviously serial murderers. There's no profit involved here to speak of, but yet they are committing these very violent crimes. And my thinking was, there has to be a reason why someone would commit a crime over and over again of a similar type. And of course, that's when I started to see the correlations. At that time, one of the test pilot cases that I got involved in, and then subsequently was brought on as a consultant to various law enforcement agencies at the city, county, state, and in some cases, federal cross consulting as well. At that time, there was a case known as Edward Surratt. Edward Surratt was an individual in Pennsylvania who, at the time, we didn't know who it was, obviously, but there was a series of crimes occurring with random nature across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and then down the eastern seaboard. And this was at a time before the term serial murderer had actually even come out and was developed. And so anyway, at that time, the task force was organized in Allegheny County in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, by now a deceased sheriff by the name of Eugene Kuhn. He was the sheriff of Allegheny County, right in Pittsburgh, and he brought together this task force, asked me to be on the task force as a criminal personality profiler. And the reason why is because the nature of these crimes didn't fit any pattern that they could see. They weren't being committed for profit. They appeared to be completely random, but at the same time, there was some similarities in terms of the violence that was being used at storming a residence, 9 times out of 10, storming the residence with a shotgun or another weapon, a handgun, but most of the times it was a shotgun, killing the male immediately, and then abducting and torturing the female. Property was never touched. There was oftentimes at the scene of the crime valuables, there's money, jewelry, etc., left behind. So obviously this was not a for-profit type of offender. This was an offender that was satisfying some very deep-seated personal psychological needs. And over the course of time, after several of these had occurred, I developed a profile. The profile was used by the task force, and sure enough, it did exactly what profiles are supposed to do, and that's to take the global pool of potential suspects and then facilitate the efficacy of the resources of law enforcement such that they could then focus their investigation on a smaller group. So starting out maybe with a suspect pool of 20, 30 people, using a really well-designed profile can shrink that group down to a very small number and therefore increase the intensity of the investigation and hopefully bring it to an end. And that's exactly what it did. So ultimately, there is and I think, Laura, I think you have a particular file a trailer that I had sent to you on the Edward Surratt case.
Yes.
And the trailer is known as the Year of Blood. That's the title that he gave it. It is a documentary that's in production. The bottom line is the profile was accurate and facilitated in doing exactly what it was supposed to do, which was guiding law enforcement resources to a pinpoint accuracy, which then led to the tracking down, and we all participated in it, down the eastern seaboard of the United States, where we ultimately arrested Edward Surratt in Florida. And if you look at the numbers on him, he's one of the most prolific serial killers, killing the largest number and the quickest number of victims, I think, of any other serial killer known at this point in time. So he was killing at an extreme rate. So that's how I became involved in the work of profiling.
Wow. I mean, it's so extensive and impressive. I think for when we started speaking with Laura, she was just raving about how much you helped her through her process. So I was curious to see how the two of you connected and what your thoughts were, Allan, on Laura's work and what she was doing.
Sure. Yeah, good question. First of all, Laura deserves a lot of credit. She's worked very hard at something that most people don't want to work at, which is talking with these folks being serial killers. How I met Laura was at a conference at the Wecht Institute of Forensic Science and the Law, where I serve as a board of director for that institute and a frequent presenter as well. She was attending one of the presentations, and that's where I met her. That's how we developed a friendship and interest in each other's work. It became apparent to me that this is a young lady who was highly motivated, very, very curious about what makes people tick. Obviously, she was in school at the time, and she was very interested. She started to develop an interest in developing a questionnaire, which ideally would facilitate a better understanding of why people do what they do, especially in serial killing. And I know that she's working in tandem with another academic, Dr. White, on the development of this questionnaire. So over the course of time, we cross-consulted with one another. She began to share the elements of her work, which basically were extensive interviews with killers confined primarily at San Quentin prison, and making trips and or phone calls to do interviews with them, all with the intent, starting out, at developing this questionnaire and the accuracy of it for academic purposes and ultimately for law enforcement use, but then quickly realized that there was another element that she was fascinated with, which became a burning passion for her, which was to, in the course of talking with these convicted serial killers, finding out from them where their victims are that are still out there, that have never been recovered by law enforcement. So I found this to be really interesting because it's a noble, almost altruistic kind of goal to be able to get a convicted killer to tell her where bodies were located so that she could facilitate in the search efforts and ultimately bring peace of mind and closure to the families of the decedents. So I found that to be very, very interesting, and I know that she's put a tremendous amount of work into it and spent a lot of her own time and financial resources to accomplish that goal.
And when you learned about her study, can you tell us a little bit about that? Because everyone's fascinated with her study, and they keep referring to her as the second mine hunter, and why, what motivated her, and especially in the documentary world where we work mostly. It's been interesting. So for us, it would be great to hear from your perspective what your thoughts are on the study, how you think it helps.
Well, I think in a nutshell, without getting boring over the detail, I think in a nutshell, the whole concept behind the questionnaire was to, at this point in time, to develop questions that do not have a right or wrong answer. So there's approximately 70 questions on this questionnaire that she's worked on with Dr. White. And of course, I would encourage you to ask her more specific questions about this as soon as I finish talking. But the questions are associated with, there's no right or wrong answer. They are questions specifically associated with developmental episodes and personal experiential episodes of that individual who's already been convicted of a serial crime, a serial murder. So the whole purpose of it is to look for, again, correlatives of personality factors. What do these folks share in common? What makes them tick? What types of behavioral characteristics do they share? So obviously that touches on the range of anywhere from looking at their answers and then subjectively interpreting those answers as case studies to plug them into labels such as, is there the presence of psychopathy? Are there the presence of antisocial personality disorder? Are there trace evidence in their answers of narcissism? Are there trace evidence in their answers of sadistic personality disorders? Are there trace evidences in there of pedophilia or any of the paraphilias that exist in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders? So I think, in essence, her focus on the questionnaire is to look for correlations in this specialized group of serial killers that can then be transferred or translated into diagnostic labels to help understand their motivations for committing the types of crime they commit. So it's very similar to the type of work that I started out doing back in the 70s.
Wow. I have a question for you. And I guess this can go to both you and Laura, and I'm sure it's a combined question. But in your research of doing all of this, I mean, from an academic level, obviously, have you encountered any resistance from the current law, in the career in law enforcement in general, about what you do and whether or not it felt like it was important enough for them? Because law enforcement is such a complex type of thing, and as we know, even today and even in the past, it's a minefield, and as minefield as far as enforcement, finding criminals, investigating, and also the resources. Now you have all the resources that are being pulled from law enforcement. How much weight, since you've done this study, has been given to what you're trying to do and what Laura's trying to do? And has there been any opposition saying, well, we don't have time for that. We have to solve these crimes. We don't have time to figure out. We don't have time to figure out the why and get like all these studies because they take too long. Yeah. There's an immediacy to what we have to do.
Yeah, excellent question. So let me answer it this way. I think when I first started out doing this in the 70s, I distinctly remember a lot of skepticism from the law enforcement community. Law enforcement officers saying this sounds like witch hunting. This sounds like random shots in the dark. And in fact, some of that is true in the early stages, because in the early stages, where the validity of these types of studies gains its muscle is in the numbers. It's an actuarial game. Let me explain. When you study and look for personality traits that can be objectified and measured in a group of 10 people versus a group of 1,000 people, the validity and the reliability, the predictive accuracy of those personality traits dramatically changes, simply because of the mega-analytic nature of the study. When we look at sex offenders, you think a sex offender is a sex offender, and that's not true. All sex offenders are quite different. When we do risk analysis on sex offenders, there are actuarial instruments that we can use to determine what the risk of a sex offender is for reoffending going forward. So it is a predictive tool, but it's not a predictive tool. These tools are not based upon random opinions. They're based upon actuarial numbers that are driven by large sample sizes, looking specifically for factor analysis in each of the samples that correlate with each other. So the bigger the sample size is that you have, that you're looking for the correlation of personality factors, the more accuracy your probability will be on predicting the type of person you're looking for. In one of the cases that I worked with, I'll give you an example. His name is Dennis Foy. F-O-Y. Allegheny County, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, geriatric rapist. This was a young man at the time. What we had was a series of rapes of elderly women throughout the city of Pittsburgh. Allegheny County Homicide Unit had reached out to the FBI at the time. This would have been back in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And of course, the response was, we have no database of geriatric rapists to speak of. Smart answer, because that's where the accuracy of the prediction on profiling comes from, is on the database of actual case studies that have been done to look for correlative features in personality composition. I, on the other hand, fortunately at the time, did have a database of geriatric rapists because I was looking specifically for geriatric rapists in my sample groups. In that particular case, the working for it with them as their criminal personality profiler provided to them a profile, which was very, very specific because the pathology of geriatric raping is extremely rare. But we had enough to make a profile from it, and they used the profile and clearly identified the perpetrator and closed the case quickly. Another case is...
I also saw, just real quick, I just wanted to kind of, because that case was kind of interesting. When you talked about it, I just quickly looked it up, and it sounded like he was pleading his innocence, and he had the Innocence Project in his back pocket, and then DNA confirmed that he was the rapist.
Correct. Right. Very good. Yeah, you did your homework quickly. A lot of the cases that my profiling has been used on has been challenged by the Innocence Project. I still hold the oldest rating for another case called the Mudd homicide. And this was a case, again, in the city of Pittsburgh that was based on flashback memory recall of a young child. That case had been challenged by numerous attorneys, defense attorneys, including prior federal prosecutors who had turned defense attorneys through the Innocence Project. And the whole argument was based upon there's no way that repressed memory recall can be accurate enough to substantiate a conviction in a jury trial on a homicide. I was asked at that time by the law enforcement community to do the interview of the young child who then became a young man because he recalled the details of this offense that he witnessed as a child, but now he's in his early 20s when he's recalling it. And they had asked me to come in and conduct the interviews to determine the validity of his recollection, which I did. And everything was recorded in that particular, brought before a judge in Allegheny County, and the jury found him guilty. The Innocence Project challenged that as well. Numerous appeals were filed, all to no avail. He still stands convicted of the murder.
That's fascinating. Laura, can you talk a little bit about your questionnaire and why you decided on the questions that you did and what the response was?
Well, I think, Allan, you put it perfectly in the description to, eliminate them being able to manipulate anybody, giving out this questionnaire or turning it into a test for future purposes and taking out, true or false type of questions as well. Multiple choice, I wanted this to be, free form for them to go and for us to dig through their thought process and their behaviors and look at the correlations from the underlying personality, traits that are going to emerge while answering these questions. And that's what Dr. White and I are doing right now, is actually putting it into developing a scale to actually measure these answers and the correlations found between the offenders.
When you started speaking to Allan, was this before you met Bittaker or after?
This was right after.
So, Allan, when she told you that she was speaking with Bittaker, what did you think?
Well, that was in the early stages, obviously, and I didn't know that much about Laura until she explained to me what it is that she was doing, which we have already covered. And then over the course of time, during conversations with Laura, it became known to me through her obvious clarification that she was very interested in trying to develop rapport with Bittaker, not just to collect information as it relates to the questionnaire, but to facilitate finding some of the victims. And there was a series of victims, obviously, that he had in his partner in crime had done, Roy Norris. And so it became obvious to me that her interest was in trying to develop questions to get Bittaker to talk about locations of victims. And we had some really intense conversations that I think did pay off royally, by the way, about what makes Bittaker Bittaker. And again, this is all predicated on what I've already talked with you about, and that is understanding what the core needs are of an offender, a violent offender, I think are so important to then understanding what makes that violent offender tick. So if we look at Bittaker and you look at some of the behaviors that he was involved with his victims, that to the person looking in from outside the window would say, what in God's name was that all about? For instance, what in God's name was it all about relative to sticking an ice pick in a young woman's ears? Well, right off the surface, it makes no sense at all, other than it's a torturous act, it's heinous, it's violent. But I look beyond that. And in the conversations that I have with Laura, I said, we need to look beyond that. We need to now look at what is he really trying to tell us that his needs are that he's trying to satisfy. And sure enough, going back with her questions, talking with Bittaker, we found our answers. And in fact, the whole concept of stabbing a young female in the ears is because his girlfriend never listened to him. So this act became symbolic for no one ever listening to him. And how do you listen? You listen through your ears. Again, this is where, to your question, Rob, about, how was this responded to early on? Whenever you bring these types of proposed correlations up to law enforcement circles, oftentimes they kind of raise their eyebrow and drop their head and say, wow, that sounds like it's pretty far-fetched. But when your sample size grows and you see those correlations occurring in 10, 20, 30, 100, 300 cases, it's pretty hard to argue that they're fantasy oriented.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's fascinating how when you stand back from it and you look at it from that perspective, it almost, like, I never even thought about that. No. I mean, it's like that, but that it's such a metaphor for what he's going through and what prompted him to do it in the first place. The anger and the pain that he was kind of inflicting was all that from inside that was been bubbling over from whatever he encountered and experienced in his lifetime.
Right. Well, if you look at his life, it's a tragic one. He was obviously born in 1940 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, ironically. Right? Unwanted child of a couple who had chosen not to have children. Placed in an orphanage at his birth by his mother. He
wasn't placed in the orphanage, but the mother, the couple did not want children.
Right.
The family had made the young mother, she was like 17, give up him and his Irish twin brother, Charles, who's a year younger. And he never felt wanted by the mother. The father never came back for him. And then he's placed with the two aunt and uncle and he always said he felt like he was just there renting a room or something, like totally ignored, like all childhood, young adult life.
It's always a fine line because it's hard to feel empathy for a person that has done such horrific acts of violence against so many people.
No, absolutely.
And it's always a fine line for me because you look at that and you're thinking, okay, there are other people who have suffered in those ways as children. What is the switch? Where does it turn from that to thinking it's okay to go and murder people and use an ice pick and do all these horrific things? That's always what's been fascinating to us, trying to understand these things.
Yeah, I think first of all, I don't look at this as developing empathy for him because there is no empathy for people who do these sort of things. But it's an understanding of why he did what he did. And again, I think that's really important. It's important from a proactive viewpoint because it clearly shows that our behavior is in fact part of what we experience developmentally. Those are where our primary lessons are learned. So I think from an educational perspective and from a proactive perspective, this is where social service programs, mental health treatment programs focus now more intently than they did back in the 60s on the importance of how children are treated. Back in the 50s and 60s, corporal punishment was okay. And studies have clearly shown, no, it's not okay because you can literally trigger a child as they grow older into realizing that the true solution to something they don't like is to become violent, is to become aggressive. So I think my experience has shown me that with people like Bittaker, yes, he did have a bad history. There's no doubt about it. And I think a lot of his behavior, and Laura can speak to it more clearly than I, but a lot of his behavior is driven by these very awful experiences that he himself had. Obviously, now we see the end result of it.
Laura, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So when Bittaker, he's with the adoptive parents and they're older. I want to say they were like 40 or early 40s when they got him. And again, they didn't want kids, and they went through so many businesses and jobs switching around. So they moved from state to state to state. So again, Bittaker's also not in a controlled environment, or he's not being raised in a stable household. He's always uprooted throughout his entire childhood too. He described how he never had a birthday party. He never had any kind of like normalcy that, most children have. And he didn't have any playmates. He never had play dates. He never had friends over from school. He essentially never had a friend. And when you go and look at him and Norris and like kind of that twisted friendship that they had, and then that Bittaker never had a friend growing up, or a friend pretty much essentially his whole life, you can see why he had such a sick connection to Norris.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, if he's never had a friend, and it also makes sense as to why he would be so open with you as well, because you were consistent with him and you were reliable.
Right.
Yeah. But that also poses the question what Cindy was saying before. I know a lot of people who've had horrible circumstances growing up. I mean, horrible, vile. Some people have come from war-torn nations, and, people have been abused. My mother herself had a horrible, horrible upbringing and grew up to be an amazing woman and mother. So the question still bears is like, what's the difference? What's the thing that we're all trying to figure out that kind of throws that switch that changes someone from from those circumstances into a horrific murder?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's truly a puzzle. It's the nature versus nurture argument. How much of our behavior today is governed by our prior behavioral experiences while we're growing up, as opposed to how much is then driven by our genetic composition, our predispositions towards certain behaviors. Struggled with this for a gazillion years, and so far there is no clear answer to that question.
Yeah, no, that's a tough one. I mean, because I had a woman that worked for me, and her uncle was Gary Ridgway, and which led to us, we did a documentary about that family. And the main reason she wanted to do the documentary is because she had just become a new mother, and she was really concerned at that DNA being passed on to her, skipping a generation and being passed on to her kids. I know there's been a lot of work done on this. I think it's, like you said, it's nature, nurture. I mean, we're all like in a martini shaker of chromosomes that gets thrown out. We don't know how it all lays out in the end. And like you said, I think that's the question that I don't know if we'll ever have an answer for. I don't know if tech can kind of help accelerate what's the studies of this and kind of identify and predetermine who's going to be more susceptible to those behaviors, and almost like in a Minority Report, kind of doing a pre-crime on people.
Sure.
Is that something that you think could possibly be happening in the future?
Well, yeah, I do, and I think it all gets to the concept of probability ratings. I don't think we'll ever see a definitive equation to answer that question. I don't think that's possible, but I do know what is possible, and that is probability rating analysis, because that is what is emerging now in the whole prediction field of reoffending behavior, especially with sexual psychopathology. So boiling it down to simple language is this: an individual who grows up in an environment that's got everything stacked against him or her, violent background, abandonment from primary caregivers, early experimentation and abuse of drugs and alcohol, history of being physically, sexually abused, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That type of person with all of those very negative prior experiences, in general, has a higher probability for engaging in aberrant social behavior than a person who does not. We do know that historical behaviors do control and predict more accurately future behaviors than anything else that we've seen. So, in a nutshell, I think probability ratings are what we need to go with, because that's what's being used now in not only in law enforcement as it relates to criminal personality profiling, but it's also being used now and accepted in the courts. I testify on a regular basis as an expert in criminal court as it relates to sexual offenders. I'm one of the founding members of the Megan's Law, helped write the legislation under Governor Ridge for the state of Pennsylvania for Megan's Law, and one of the founding members of the Pennsylvania Sexual Offenders Assessment Board, and still serve on that board as an appointee from the governor of the state of Pennsylvania. As it relates to doing work for that board, as well as in my private practice, oftentimes Sexual offenders prior to sentencing will need evaluations completed on them to make determinations as to who's truly violent in their particular crime. So if you look at that law, it talks about sexually violent predator classification standards, which I helped to develop as well. And all of this is based upon probability ratings. Our actuarial testing is based upon probability ratings. It doesn't mean that it's a completely 100% accurate prediction, but it is more accurate than throwing a guess because it's based on probability. And probability is driven by factors specifically associated with known behaviors that we can already measure.
What do we learn from Laura's work? And what can we learn from Laura's work? I guess is the right question.
I think it's a great question for Laura.
No, I mean, I'm just in general. I mean, no, but I'm just saying because we talk to Laura a lot, and so we're trying to get a perspective. So from an outside viewpoint, and because I wanted to know from an outside, another person who has been doing this for years, what can we learn from finding out how these killers dispose of bodies and hide them, and and the benefit of finding out where these victims are.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a two-part question. So let me answer the first part since you're directing it to me. I think the benefit of Laura's work is simply stated this way. There is no limit to the amount of information that we should try to get in terms of understanding the pathologies associated with these types of violent behaviors. The more, the better. So I don't think there is any clinician out there who can say they've got the market cornered on collecting data as it relates to facilitating the accurate prediction or identification of profiles of serial killers. It's impossible to do. So collectively, if we all work in the same direction, which is what Laura is doing, what I'm doing, and there's other really good professionals in the field that are doing the same thing, we're all shooting for the same goal, and that is to get as much information as we can to improve the accuracy of what it is that we're trying to do, which is identify who these people are after the fact. Ideally, in some ideal world, and I think this is not as ideal as it may seem, but I think collecting this information does educate our society, our cultural systems, our educational systems, our children and youth service systems to be able to identify the markers of what's occurring to children as children, to take the corrective measures to then minimize the probability that these children will continue to be abused and may grow up to become one of these really distorted individuals who commit these types of crimes.
Yeah, and Laura, and directed towards you, what is the most significant thing you've learned by looking and talking with these serial killers, and when you're asking them where they've disposed their victims and the places they have hid them and why? I mean, what is the thing that stands out the most to you?
I wouldn't say it's just one thing. I'm seeing multiple things like arise. I'm seeing, with the abandonment issue, them taking their victims captive and wanting to hold their victims, because they're afraid, kind of from like childhood, if they're abandoned from their mother, their father, the neglect, that need, as Allan was talking about, to hold them captive. I'm seeing that almost across the board, I would say.
One of the things I was pretty interested in is when you were at our place and we were recording an interview with Wayne Adam Ford. One of the things that stuck out to me, and Allan, I would love for you to address this. I mean, Laura and I have talked about it with Cindy, is he mentioned he had a head trauma when he was younger. I think, was it in the Marine Corps, Laura, where he had the head trauma?
With Ford, it was in the Marine Corps. It was a motorcycle. He got hit by a motorcycle.
Yes, and how much of that, I mean, because we know now that we're kind of discovering all the CTE from football players, and that has motivated them to go into depression. Some of them have killed themselves. Some of them are doing things that are breaking the law. And how much of that it comes into play into motivating or kind of compelling people to kill?
Well, that's a big question. Let me see if I can put it into categories. So your question, I think what I'm framing it up as is, how much does organicity, biological damage, contribute to violent behavior? We do know that that's a factor that has to be considered. When you look at individuals who have a propensity for losing emotional control and physical control, you do see a lot of head trauma cases. Organic brain damage, usually to the frontal temporal lobes, is what pops up a lot. You also have environmental cross-contamination from a biochemical viewpoint. We know that lead in the environment, as it's ingested by people, can contribute to loss of aggression control issues. So we know that there's neurological, organic components to violent behavior, as well as just standing alone. So an individual who's perfectly healthy, no evidence of brain damage, no evidence of neurological problems, no evidence of chemical cross-contamination by ingesting toxic substances. Can they still become violent? The answer is yes. But we do know that those types of factors also contribute to it. And as a matter of fact, again, contribute to increasing the probability for aggressive control issues. So again, what we learn from that is being more careful about head injuries for children, which is what the NFL now has witnessed because of the project involved with head trauma. Schools becoming more careful about lead components in the environment and asbestos because children are exposed to this. And can it lead to ongoing resulting damages? And the answer is yes. So again, I think this is another supportive argument for why it's important to understand these factors so that we can apply them to our environment to minimize the risk of continuing this maddening cycle of having people act out aggressively.
One of the things that Laura has been telling us about since we met her is how helpful you were to her during the last days of Bittaker's life and those deathbed interviews that you helped her prep for, which are really compelling and overwhelming to listen to. So I was wondering if you could let us speak to us about what that was like and what the process was for that and what you were prepping, how you were prepping her.
Well, when Laura approached me about talking with Bittaker, obviously she had expressed the goal, as we all know, because we covered it in this podcast, that not only was it about the questionnaire, but ultimately then it transformed into identifying where bodies are for closure purposes for the decedent's families, and because it's the right thing to do, basically. She had asked me, in my opinion, are there certain types of interview styles, not interrogation, but interview styles. And there's a world of difference between interrogations and interviews. Are there topics that can be covered, or linguistically how best to approach an interview with someone, especially someone who's sitting on death row or suffering from a terminal illness? In this case, he had both. Bittaker was sentenced to death, and he was also dying of terminal cancer. He passed away in December of 2019, and Laura's conversation with me intensified around specific linguistic strategies of how to interview someone who knows that they are dying, either through the death penalty or through natural causes. And one of the things that I want to emphasize here is that, did Bittaker have ample chances to commit suicide during his life? The answer is a resounding yes. He had opportunities to self-terminate in the free world, and he had opportunities to self-terminate in the confined world. But yet the evidence clearly shows us that he did not. From that, we can assume that he did not want to die. Otherwise, he would have taken his own life. Knowing that individuals who are dying of natural causes, who are killers, who are convicted of crimes, of violent crimes, and who are there waiting to be executed, the question then becomes what type of approach can you take with them with the questions that would facilitate deeper, more profound reactions? And I think the answer is simply this. Knowing that he doesn't want to die, we have to approach the types of questions that we use under the premise that this is his chance to tell his final story. This is his chance to take the interview in any direction that he wants to take it because of his own needs of what he has to tell. Because remember, if you can, just focus on this for a second. Individuals who are dying know that they are dying and that their life is going to then end. And as a result of that, their time is extremely limited. And as a result of having that time being extremely limited, they know that their ability to get their story out, whatever that looks like, is limited. So the types of questions, the types of linguistic approaches that I advise Laura with is to demonstrate a lot of verbal kindness, to allow him and encourage him to discuss other topics, not just the target topic, because the target topic will focus him. But allowing him to discuss other topics around the target topic then provides him with a sense of control, which is ultimately what he needs, because that's what his crimes all said. His crimes told us clearly that he needs to be in control because that makes him feel omnipotent. And even on his deathbed, that is what he needed. And that is what Laura gave him. She asked questions about his personal developmental history leading up to the target topic behaviors. Asked questions to him as to why someone would engage in the behaviors associated with the target topics. This takes the pressure off of him to open up the door to speculate as to why he thinks other people would do what he did. When in fact, he doesn't really know, but he's opening a window into his own soul, into his own mind, as to why he thinks he did what he did. Don't use any leading questions, because your leading questions as an interviewer completely shows your bias in your beliefs, and it cross-contaminates the nature of him telling his own story. Never threaten the subject with consequences. We don't need to threaten him. He's already in the ultimate threatened category of death. He's going to die. So it's these types of concepts that I emphasized in the linguistic approach of this empathetic interview with Bittaker to allow him to tell his story about who he is and what he is. And I think it worked.
Yeah.
Yeah, it works.
I think it worked too.
Yeah.
Hey, Laura, how did it feel to have someone helping you guide through that? I know you've. I mean, it's great to have a coach. You basically have a coach to kind of do something difficult. How much was that helpful?
Yeah, I think Alan and I would be emailing each other back and forth, and I would say Jack Crawford, he'd say Clarice, because it was it's so intense, and it's genius serial killer, and I'm going in there. I had somebody to go back and talk with and decompress with, and just everything in between, and the deathbed interviews are a different ballgame, like a completely different ballgame. And Alan has interviewed serial killers, on their deathbed too, and he can even confirm it's a very different interview. It's very, very emotionally charged. It's spilling out everything, all their emotions, all the details of their life, everything they think is important to tell you starts just coming out in those final interviews. And I described it in the show as like a profound experience, because you're watching somebody, this is not a regular human being dying. This is someone who has killed people for pleasure, and now they're facing death on their own. And you're there. You're the only person there with them as they're facing this.
Wow.
That's a big responsibility for you as well, as you're trying to get this information out of him. How did that feel?
Oh, it was so intense. I mean, it was really a roller coaster, because, he'd be hysterically crying at one minute, angry about everything the next. And it's just, everything just starts flooding out during the interview.
Yeah. I guess one of the questions that I bubbling in my head, hearing about all this, is, and this is both of you, and you guys can, Alan, you first. How do you process and kind of, and also separate? Because we have to do this all, because we've been doing true crime producing for a long time in documentaries. We have a lot of experience dealing with victims, families, and killers. But you guys are so intensely involved in it, and the details in the study. How do you separate your personal feelings and of what this person's done and your clinical outlook on getting the information that you need to get from these people? And how do you process that as a person?
It's difficult, I will tell you that. I've been doing this since 1973, so you can do the math. It's a long time. And I think what helps me to process this in a healthy, constructive way, and then consequently prevents me from losing my own sense of self in terms of sanity and or compassion for people in general, is to look at it as objectively as I can, thinking the whole time, and realizing, by the way, not just thinking it, but then seeing the positive results that come from it in terms of assisting law enforcement to do an incredibly difficult job. Their job, investigators in these types of cases, are, you want to talk about stress, you want to talk about frustration, it's profound. But I think for me, the ability to do this objectively, to provide a tool, help them focus to get a very, very important job done, I think is satisfying to me and provides a sense of reward, knowing that a person who is taking other people's lives is now taken off the street. I think, is a rewarding feeling. And at the same time, feeling compassion for the offender as well. And that sounds odd, I'm sure, but it's true. And I've actually even made that statement in court while testifying. One case comes to mind where I actually said while I was testifying in the witness box as an expert for the defense in this case, it was a violent sexual offense. But I felt very sympathetic for the offender. And of course, the defense attorney quickly said, well, why is that? And it's kind of a shocked look on his face. I said, well, because if he would have gotten involved in therapy at an appropriate age when the psychosexual pathologies were emerging, none of us would be sitting here today. And he would be leading a relatively normal life. And I think that's something that you have to always remember, is that even though these people who commit these types of serial murders can be looked at by the common person in our society as a monster, and their behaviors and their actions truly are monstrous. At one point in time, this was an infant. This was an infant who was brought into this world as a child. And somewhere along the line, because of all those things that we've already talked about in this podcast, there was a train wreck that happened. And if we could have been there to stop that train wreck from happening, these monstrous behaviors most likely would not have occurred.
That's a fantastic point. We all come into this world innocent. And then there's a point at which that loss of innocence happens. And for some people, they overcome it, become prosperous, and also healthy and serving civilians in this society. And then there's the other ones that just, it goes the other way.
Yes, it's very sad to watch.
Yeah. And I'm sure you've seen the degradation of people in the process. I mean, I know we have, but from your perspective and Laura's perspective, you deal with it on such a micro level that can be overwhelming, I would imagine. And Laura, why don't you speak a little bit about that and your experience with that? Because, I mean, you're just at the beginning journey of this. You've kind of been thrust in there, and you've kind of been put on a pedestal based upon the stuff that you're doing, your unique work, which a lot of people that we've talked to in the true crime world have really like going, some of them are saying this is fantastic, other ones are going like, why? So how do you process dealing with all of this, the darkest forces that humanity provides?
I was just telling Alan before we all jumped on, my father is a professor, academic, and then my grandfather is also a PhD academic. So I had that academic research base always passed down to me, the love for it. And, I grew up with, you put emotion to the side when it comes to research and academic standpoints. So it was always very natural for me to do and kind of look into subjects where you don't have any bias. If you put your bias in, it's going to compromise the findings into it. So I'm really able to take that out of it. It's hard, like Alan said. I mean, it's not easy, especially with this subject matter. I put it to the side and, when I have to think about what I'm hearing and processing it emotionally, that comes later when I'm alone. I'm not doing that, in the field when I'm sitting in front of a serial killer. I'm always able to put that to the side and always keep on mission, not just for the study and the research, but, finding the victims that are out there and they're willing to talk about sitting with you.
Yeah, I know we've been fortunate enough to see you work close up, and it's very interesting how you kind of ping pong between casualness and then like laser focused academic researcher. Like the conversation sways back and forth to like small talk to then you throw a question at them that elicits information and kind of taps into their mind and they kind of start spilling their guts. It's really quite fascinating to watch.
Well, I've developed it when you're starting to talk to them. You really develop a style of how to do it. And you start to read them. You know when to pull back, and the pullback is going to be like the small talk. You're going to let them decompress for a second, and we're just going to have a casual conversation. We're still, I'm here with you. Let's have a quick laugh because we're diving into something very heavy. But then I'm, as we start talking again, I'm going to get laser focused. But I always know I can read them, and I know when to pull back and when it's going too hard. I also know when to pounce. They're saying something and I know when to jump. You never want to go too hard at them, but there are moments where you have to pounce. There's moments when you have to pull back, and you start to be able to do it naturally with working with offenders.
And I think it was really interesting, Alan, when you said that Laura's main goal is a little bit altruistic as well as very commendable, that she's going in there to get this information from these horrific killers in order to help bring some of these victims home. And I think some of that gets lost in all of her her work, and people don't realize that that's one of her main objectives. And I think it's really important to stay on point with that and to remind people that she's doing this for a reason. There's always a purpose to every interview you've had with these killers, and we've watched you, which is why we really believe in the work that you're doing and how important it is. And I was wondering how the law enforcement community, in your opinion, Allan, views that.
Well, I think they have a high regard for it because at the end of the day, law enforcement in these types of cases not only want to get the collar, in other words, not only want to make the arrest, but they also definitely do want to bring closure to the families. And in cases of serial killers where bodies are missing, they want to find those bodies. They want to find those victims, and so that they can bring their remains home to the family for that ultimate closure that everything is done. So I think their reaction, my conversations with them, working with them over many, many years, that is one of their primary goals, is to get that closure. And I think people like Laura, who are shooting for the same target, obviously are commended for it, because you can never have too much help. That's the thing we all have to remember. It takes a village, right, to raise people, and it takes a community to facilitate law enforcement to do their job adequately. If you go into communities where, because of the socioeconomic status of that community or the history of that community with law enforcement, they've developed a no snitch attitude, so therefore they don't cooperate with the police, they don't call in tips about things that they're seeing. The job of law enforcement in those cities is so much more difficult because they're not getting the help from the community to do what they need to do, which is to bring law and order back to the city. So in these types of cases, the more people that we can have that are interested in helping law enforcement bring closure to these types of crimes with information about the perpetrator, things that they have seen, things that they believe might be connected as clues to these types of crimes to solve them, information about where they believe maybe the victims were dumped. This type of input from the community is so invaluable. And I think this is also one of the reasons why you see in social media now the super sleuths of the community coming forward. Is it perhaps part of it is because they want to gain some social recognition for their contributions, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, if they are assisting law enforcement in doing their job, then I commend them. I commend what Laura is doing in terms of trying to find the victims, because the families need it. And the more we get that word out, the more we can get social interest to help find the victims.
I agree. I'm glad you said that about the sleuths, and because we're television producers, but we also have a live investigation podcast where we're investigating a cold case of a double homicide, and it's that delicate balancing act that we kind of, because we're working with law enforcement. Currently we're working with the BIA on this case in Oklahoma, and we always have to have these discussions whether or not what we're going to be putting out there is going to either help or maybe hurt the investigation. And the good news is that after 35 one-hour episodes of that podcast, it's because of the podcast, the case got elevated to the BIA level and taken away from the local law enforcement, which means it's got a better chance of being solved because they have more resources and they have more, and they're putting more attention to it as opposed to the local law enforcement who just basically abandoned the case. So,
and Rob, that's an extremely good point, because the law enforcement community is very protective of itself for obvious reasons, because not everybody in our community likes police. At the end of the day, especially in today's social climate and some of the things that we see on national news in terms of how they conduct themselves. But we have to realize, I think, as a group of people, that there is a phrase called law and order. And if you don't have law, you will have no order. So the more we as a community can contribute to the police to do what they need to do in a humane way, in a logical way, in a scientific way, the better off we're all going to be, because we don't want to go to sleep at night with a gun under our pillow.
No.
Worried about who's going to break in and take us hostage or kill us or kill our children. We want to live in a comfortable culture. We want to live with a sense of peace. And that piece comes about as a result of the community pulling together to help one another and to also help law enforcement do their job in accordance with the legal standards that they're entrusted with.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better. Laura, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I completely agree.
Well, listen, this has been awesome. Allan, the two of you have done such amazing work, and I see the mentor-mentee thing happening here. It's really nice to see, and that you're passing on all of this great knowledge that you've learned all these years, Allan, and Laura's gonna. I feel like she's picking up the torch and she's running it in her own direction. And I think the fact that she has you to kind of advise her and coach her is fantastic. I'm a full proponent in that. I'm a mentor to some people before, and it's a very rewarding experience. I can see how it's kind of flourished your guys' relationship just based upon just talking to both of you. But the fascinating work you guys do and continue to do, I think, is invaluable to society. And I do believe that soon in the future, law enforcement will take this. They're taking it seriously. I think some facets of law enforcement are taking it seriously. Others are more kind of, dying a wool but I think it's important work, and I think people really need to understand it more. And thank you so much for sharing all that information with us.
Sure. Well, thank you for taking the time to have us on.
Yes, it was lovely to meet you, Allan. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, good luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, guys.
Next time on Partners in True Crime.
On this season of Partners in True Crime, The Serial Killer Whisperer, we will be following Laura Brand's incredible journey as she continues her groundbreaking study on serial killers.
Each week, we will release never-before-heard recordings of her conversations with the most notorious killers in hopes to get answers for the victims' families, and maybe that could lead to recovering their lost remains.
Please visit our website where you can subscribe to the podcast, find show notes, and check out extra content from all of our podcasts. All rights reserved. This has been a production of 722 Media Content.